June 10th, 1912. That humid night when Villisca, Iowa, fell into a deep sleep. The Moore family and their guests returned home from a church service filled with prayers. They locked the door. They blew out the lamp. But what they didn't know was that the house had already started breathing before they even arrived. Someone was waiting in the attic, among the dusty rafters. For hours, he sat like a statue in the darkness, listening to the sounds below. Josiah's laughter, the children's jokes, and finally, absolute silence. Midnight. The shadow descended from the attic. In his hand, he held Josiah's own axe. The cold iron was sweating in his palms. The first stop was the master bedroom. The blunt end of the axe crushed bone. 8 souls were extinguished that night, without letting out a single scream. But the real horror began after death. The killer didn't leave. He spent 5 whole hours in that house, with those bodies. He found every mirror in the house. He covered them with old clothes, with bed sheets, as if he were hiding from the eyes of the dead. Or maybe he couldn't stand to see the monster in his own reflection. He sealed the windows, not with curtains, but with the victim's clothes. He cut his connection with the outside world. He just sat there with them in the dark, amidst the smell of blood. As the first light of morning merged with the mist, he washed his hands in a basin of bloody water. He locked the door. He put the keys in his pocket. And he vanished like a shadow. So, who did that shadow belong to? The townspeople pointed at Frank Jones, a powerful, harsh politician. The business rivalry between him and Josiah Moore had turned into a bitter hatred. Perhaps he hired a hitman to uproot an entire family. Or was it Reverend George Kelly, who was at the church that night? That man with a history of mental instability, giving sermons on blood sacrifice. When he confessed years later, he said God told him to slay the children. But the court didn't believe him. Maybe it was neither. Maybe it was a stranger who stepped quietly off the train tracks that night. That phantom serial killer who hunted sleeping families with his axe in other towns across the Midwest, covering their mirrors. The house in Villisca still stands. The mirrors are still there. But the man who locked that door and put the key in his pocket that night has long since returned to the earth with his secret. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was a routine trip from New York to Miami. The aircraft, a Lockheed L-1011, was carrying 176 people. As the plane prepared to land, the crew noticed a small green light on the instrument panel failed to turn on. This light was supposed to confirm the landing gear was locked, while the captain, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer, Don Repo, were all focused on the tiny bulb. The autopilot was accidentally deactivated. The aircraft slowly lost altitude without any warning and crashed into the Florida Everglades. 101 people died in the crash, including Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo. After the investigation, the airline salvaged several undamaged sections of the aircraft from the swamp. These parts, primarily kitchen equipment and galley ovens, were cleaned and reinstalled into other L-1011 planes in the fleet. Shortly after these recycled parts were put into service, employees began documenting high-precision sightings. Flight attendants and engineers reported seeing the deceased crew members, Bob Loft and Don Repo, performing their duties on these specific aircraft. The sightings were so consistent that they were recorded in the flight logs of several different planes. The horror lies in the persistence of the dead. These were not mere shadows. They were solid, physical presences that appeared to be part of the living crew. On one specific flight on Ship 318, a flight attendant was working in the lower galley, when she saw a man in a flight engineer's uniform fixing one of the ovens. She spoke to him, and he turned around. It was Don Repo. He looked at her with a look of intense concern and said, "Watch out for fire on this airplane." He then vanished before her eyes. 10 minutes later, an engine fire forced the plane to make an emergency landing. This was not an isolated incident. Repo appeared multiple times to warn crews about technical failures that were about to happen, always near the equipment salvaged from his death site. The sightings of Captain Bob Loft were equally disturbing. On another flight, a female passenger became concerned about a man sitting in the seat next to her who appeared ill and would not respond to her. She called a flight attendant, who also could not get the man to speak. When the captain was called back to the cabin to investigate, he turned pale. He recognized the man as his former colleague, Bob Loft. As soon as the captain spoke his name, the man vanished in front of the entire row of passengers. The seat was empty, yet the seatbelt was still buckled, as if someone had just been sitting there. Eastern Airlines management attempted to suppress these stories with extreme measures. They issued a memo stating that any employee caught spreading ghost stories would be fired immediately. They even had flight logs altered to remove mentions of the apparitions. However, the fear among the staff grew so intense that entire crews refused to fly on planes containing the recycled parts. Eventually, the company quietly ordered every single piece of equipment from the 401 wreckage to be removed and melted down. They realized that the metal itself had become a vessel for the trauma of the crash. Once the last oven was destroyed, the sightings stopped. Bob Loft and Don Repo finally left their posts, but the memory of their ghostly patrols remains one of the most chilling chapters in aviation history. In 1898, a struggling writer named Morgan Robertson published a novella titled Futility. At the time, it was just another piece of fiction, a story about a massive ocean liner that met a tragic end. But 14 years later, when the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, the world realized that Robertson hadn't just written a story. He had written a technical manual for a mass grave. The similarities between his fictional ship and the real Titanic are so precise that they defy the laws of probability. The first chilling detail is the name. Robertson called his ship the Titan. 14 years later, the world's largest ship was named the Titanic. Both were described in the exact same words: the largest craft ever built by man, and more importantly, unsinkable. The structural descriptions in the book matched the real ship with terrifying accuracy. Both the Titan and the Titanic were steel giants, roughly 800 feet long, equipped with 3 massive propellers and 2 masts. The horror deepens when you look at the technical numbers. Robertson wrote that his fictional Titan carried 3,000 people, but was equipped with only 24 lifeboats, which was the legal minimum at the time. When the real Titanic set sail in 1912, it carried over 2,200 people, but had only 20 lifeboats. In both cases, there were not enough boats to save even half of the passengers. Both ships were moving at a high speed of 25 knots through the fog when the nightmare began. The geographical and chronological details are a direct mirror. Both disasters happened in the month of April. Both ships struck an iceberg on their starboard side. Both sank in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, approximately 400 miles from Newfoundland. It was as if the real Titanic was following a script that had been sitting on bookshelves for over a decade. The weight of the steel, the speed in the ice field, and the lack of life-saving equipment were all documented long before the first bolt of the Titanic was ever fastened. When the Titanic hit the iceberg in 1912, the screams of the dying were a haunting echo of the pages Robertson had written in 1898. The freezing water and the black abyss of the ocean were described with the same cold precision years before the event took place. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was a blueprint of a tragedy. Every detail of the sinking was already public knowledge for those who had read Robertson's work. The wreck of the Titanic is a monument to human pride and tragedy, but Robertson's book is a terrifying proof of something else. It suggests that sometimes the future is recorded before it happens. The story of the Titan serves as a warning that went unheeded, a prophecy that predicted the exact coordinates and conditions of a mass death. Every detail of the tragedy was waiting in the silence of a library, years before the first passenger ever stepped onto the deck of the real Titanic. On March 11th, 2011, a massive earthquake and tsunami struck the coast of Japan, claiming nearly 20,000 lives. One of the hardest-hit areas was the city of Ishinomaki, where thousands were swept away by the black tide in an instant. In the months following the disaster, as the city began to clear the debris and rebuild from the ruins, taxi drivers in Ishinomaki began reporting experiences that defied logic. These were not just rumors. These were professional drivers, many of whom were skeptical by nature, recording these encounters in their official fare logs. The pattern was almost always the same. A driver would be patrolling a desolate area near the coast, a place where homes had once stood, but were now only flat, empty foundations. A passenger would hail the cab in the middle of the night. The driver would stop, the passenger would get in, and they would ask to be taken to a destination that no longer existed, a neighborhood that had been completely erased by the tsunami. One young taxi driver in his 20s recorded a particularly haunting encounter. A woman dressed in a heavy winter coat, despite it being a warm night, climbed into his back seat near Ishinomaki Station. She asked to be taken to the Minamihama district. When the driver politely explained that the area was now a wasteland with no standing buildings, there was a long, heavy silence. He looked into his rearview mirror and asked, "Are you sure you want to go there?" The woman whispered, "Have I died?" When the driver spun around to look at the back seat, it was completely empty. Yet, the meter was still running, documenting a journey that a ghost had taken. Another driver reported a young man who looked confused and soaked with water, despite there being no rain. The man sat in the back and asked to go to a specific address on a hill. When the taxi reached the top of the hill, the driver turned to collect the fare, only to find the seat empty and cold. These sightings became so frequent that a sociology student at Tohoku Gakuen University, Yuka Kudo, began interviewing the drivers for her thesis. She found that many drivers were not afraid of these phantom passengers. Instead, they felt a deep sense of sadness and respect. They believed the dead were simply trying to go home, unaware that their homes and their lives were gone. The horror lies in the collective memory of the city. These passengers weren't malicious spirits. They were the echoes of thousands of people who were ripped from life in a single second. To this day, some taxi drivers in Ishinomaki still keep their meters ready and their doors unlocked when driving through the coastal ruins at night. They know that in the silence of the dark, someone might still be waiting for a ride to a home that only exists in the afterlife. It began with a single woman, Frau Trofea. She stepped into a narrow street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, and no joy on her face. Her movements were jagged, her muscles straining as if she were being pulled by invisible wires. She danced for 6 days straight. By the end of the week, 34 others had joined her, their bodies locked in the same rhythmic torture. Within a month, the number grew to 400. The horror lies in the biological reality of the dance. This was not a party. It was a mass cardiac event in slow motion. People were dancing until their feet bled, until their bones splintered through their skin, and until their hearts literally exploded from exhaustion. Witnesses recorded that the dancers were screaming in agony, begging to stop, yet their limbs continued to move with a supernatural autonomy. The technical reports from the city council show that at its height, the plague was killing 15 people every single day. They died of strokes, dehydration, and sheer physical collapse, their bodies dancing even as they drew their final breaths. The city's response was a catastrophic error in judgment. The authorities, advised by local physicians that the plague was caused by overheated blood, decided that the only cure was for the afflicted to dance it out. They built a massive wooden stage and hired professional musicians to play loud, fast-paced drums and pipes. This turned the streets into a literal slaughterhouse. The music provided a metronome for the dying, pushing their failing hearts to keep pace with the beat until they dropped dead on the boards. The mystery of the dancing plague of 1518 remains a chilling case of mass psychogenic illness, but the physical evidence suggests something far more sinister. Some researchers point to ergot poisoning, a fungus that grows on damp rye and causes hallucinations and violent convulsions. However, ergotism usually cuts off blood flow to the limbs, making sustained dancing impossible. The victims in Strasbourg possessed a terrifying, unnatural endurance that defied the limits of human muscle and bone. To this day, the archives in Strasbourg hold the names of those who danced themselves to death. The horror is found in the realization that the human mind can lose control of the body so completely that the machine will run itself until it breaks. It is a reminder that we are all just one psychological snap away from a rhythm we cannot stop. A dance that ends only when the heart finally bursts in the silence of a crowded street. In the freezing October of 1931, the 1,300-ton steel hull of the SS Bechimo cargo ship became hopelessly locked in the shifting pack ice off the coast of Wainwright, Alaska. Convinced that the crushing pressure of the frozen tide would splinter the massive vessel into fragments within days, the crew abandoned the ship to seek shelter on the shore. They watched from a distance as a massive blizzard swallowed the steel giant whole, and when the skies cleared the following morning, the horizon was empty. The Bechimo was gone, assumed to be resting at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. But the cargo ship had not sunk. It had transformed. Instead of succumbing to the ice, the Bechimo began a 38-year journey across the most treacherous waters on Earth, navigating without a rudder, a captain, or a single drop of fuel. The technical reality of its survival defies every law of maritime physics. In 1933, a group of Inuit who boarded the drifting vessel to escape a storm reported a rhythmic, mechanical thumping vibrating through the steel floorboards, a sound that resembled a massive metallic heartbeat pulsing from a cold, dead engine room. Throughout the decades, the Bechimo became a predatory ghost of the North, appearing and disappearing in the fog as if it possessed a biological instinct for evasion. In 1939, when a rescue ship attempted to seize the vessel, a dense, localized mist materialized around the hull, and by the time it dissipated, the Bechimo had moved rapidly against the current to vanish once more. By 1962, 31 years after its abandonment, the ship was spotted again, standing perfectly upright and buoyant, its deck looking as fresh as if the crew had left only minutes before. The true enigma of the SS Bechimo lies in its final recorded sighting in 1969, where it was seen drifting calmly through the Beaufort Sea, nearly 4 decades after it was written off as scrap metal. There is no engineering explanation for how a top-heavy merchant vessel could survive 40 winters of grinding ice packs without the constant maintenance of a human crew to pump out bilges or reinforce the hull. In June 1948, several ships navigating the trade routes of the Strait of Malacca picked up a series of frantic SOS calls in Morse code. The messages were coming from a Dutch freighter named the SS Orang Medan. The first transmission was a jumble of dots and dashes, but the second one was clear and chilling. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead. This was followed by a long, incoherent string of dots, and then 2 final haunting words: I die. The horror is captured in the physical state of the ship when the rescue vessel, the Silver Star, finally located it. There was no smoke, no fire, and no visible damage to the hull. But as the boarding party stepped onto the deck, they were met with a sight that defied every medical law. Every single member of the crew was dead, but they hadn't just died. They had frozen in a state of absolute terror. Their bodies were scattered across the deck, their eyes wide open, staring at the sun, and their arms outstretched as if they were fending off an invisible attacker. Even the ship's dog was found dead, its jaw locked in a silent snarl toward something that wasn't there. The technical anomaly grew deeper during the inspection. Despite the scorching tropical heat of the Indonesian sun, the boarding party reported that the interior of the ship felt unnaturally, bone-chillingly cold. There were no signs of wounds, struggle, or poisoning on the bodies. They looked as if they had been scared to death in a single, synchronized second. As the Silver Star prepared to tow the ghost ship to port, a mysterious fire broke out in the lower cargo hold. The rescuers barely escaped before the SS Orang Medan exploded with such force that it lifted out of the water and sank into the abyss, taking all evidence with it. The mystery of the Orang Medan remains one of the most guarded secrets of the post-war era. Some technical theories suggest a leak of potassium cyanide, or nerve gas, that was being transported illegally, which could explain the sudden deaths. However, gas doesn't explain the expressions of pure horror on the faces of the dead, nor does it explain the freezing temperatures reported in the middle of a tropical summer. The horror lies in the realization that something entered that ship, something that didn't need weapons to kill. The crew didn't die of a disease or an explosion. They died of a collective shock so intense that their hearts stopped before they could even blink. The final Morse code message, I die, remains a permanent echo in the history of the sea, a reminder that in the vast silence of the ocean, there are forces that can turn a steel ship into a floating morgue in the blink of an eye.